the dancing plague of 1518. Welcome, weary travelers of the night, to another journey through the corridors of time. I am Professor Somnus, and tonight we venture into the cobblestone streets of 16th century Strasbourg, where an extraordinary phenomenon unfolded, one that would puzzle historians and scientists for centuries to come. Tonight, we shall walk together through the summer of 1518, when the ordinary rhythms of medieval life were disrupted by something quite extraordinary. A time when the very act of dancing became both curse and mystery, spreading through a prosperous city like ripples across still water. In the pages of dusty chronicles and faded manuscripts, we find the record of events so strange, so utterly bewildering, that they challenge our understanding of human nature itself. Here was a phenomenon that began with a single woman on a single street, yet within weeks had seized hundreds in its mysterious grip. Some would call it madness, others divine punishment. Still others would seek more earthly explanations in the humors of the body or the poisons of spoiled grain. So settle back into the comfort of your evening rest and let your mind drift to those distant streets where history holds its strangest secrets. Close your eyes, turn the page, and let history guide you to sweet dreams. Chapter 1. The Setting Sun of Medieval Europe. To understand what transpired in that distant summer, we must first settle ourselves in the world of 1518. Picture, if you will, the twilight of the Middle Ages, where the Holy Roman Empire stretched like a vast patchwork quilt across the heart of Europe. Strasbourg, nestled along the Rhine River, was a city of considerable prosperity. Imagine the gentle lapping of water against stone embankments as merchant barges, laden with goods from distant lands, drifted slowly past timber-framed houses that leaned toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. The cobblestone streets, worn smooth by countless footsteps, wound their way between guild halls and market squares. Here, the blacksmith's hammer rang out its steady rhythm, while the baker's ovens glowed warm in the pre-dawn darkness, filling the air with the comforting scent of fresh bread. The cathedral bells marked the hours with their deep, resonant tones, calling the faithful to prayer at dawn, at noon, at vespers. The sun rose, as it had for centuries, casting long shadows between the narrow alleyways where cats picked their way delicately over puddles left by the night's rain. Life in Strasbourg moved to ancient rhythms. At the apex, the noble families lived in their grand houses with leaded glass windows that caught the morning light like scattered jewels. The priests, in their flowing robes, moved through the shadows, their Latin chants echoing softly in the vaulted spaces where centuries of faithful had knelt in prayer. Merchants from the north brought amber and furs, while those from the south carried spices and silks that had traveled impossible distances from lands most citizens could barely imagine. Below them, the wealthy merchants, the guild masters, the skilled artisans, each with their place, their role, their quiet dignity. The massive cathedral, with its soaring spires, dominated the skyline, reminding all who gazed upon it of powers far greater than themselves. Women in simple woolen dresses and white linen caps examined vegetables with experienced eyes, while children darted between the stalls, chasing chickens that had escaped their wicker cages. In this world, social order was as fixed as the stones in the cathedral walls. A string of poor harvests had left granaries dangerously low, and the price of bread had risen beyond the reach of many families. Political instability plagued the region as local lords squabbled over territories and the common people bore the burden of increased taxes and military conscription. The feast days of the church calendar provided welcome respites from the daily struggles, when even the poorest families could set aside their worries and join in communal celebration. To the more rustic folk dances of the common people who leaped and spun with joyous abandon, people rose with the dawn, when the first pale light crept over the rooftops and the roosters announced the new day with their raucous calls and pipes, while drums beat out infectious rhythms that seemed to call to something deep within the human soul. They worked while the light lasted, pausing only for the midday meal and the evening prayers that marked the end of another day's labor. Their hands calloused from honest work, their backs bent from carrying loads through streets that seemed to whisper stories of centuries past. And beneath them all, the laborers, the servants, the countless souls who rose before dawn and worked until the candles burned low in the evening, unaware of the extraordinary events that would soon transform its peaceful streets into a stage for one of history's most bewildering mysteries. The church in those days was not merely a place of worship, but the very heartbeat of daily existence. Inside its cool stone walls, incense drifted like ghostly prayers, while stained glass windows painted rainbows across worn stone floors. Trade routes, like arteries, carried the lifeblood of commerce through Strasbourg's gates. The Rhine itself, that ancient waterway, served as nature's highway, connecting Strasbourg to Basel in the south and the great trading centers of the Netherlands to the north. On market days, the squares filled with the voices of merchants and customers haggling good-naturedly over the price of grain, the quality of cloth, the freshness of fish brought up from the river. The rhythm of pre-industrial life was measured not by clocks, but by the sun's passage across the sky. As darkness fell, candles flickered in windows like earthbound stars, while families gathered around simple wooden tables to share their evening bread and speak in hushed tones of the day's small events. The economic conditions of 1518 were particularly harsh, even by the standards of that difficult age. A new disease had recently arrived from the New World, a terrible affliction that physicians could neither understand nor cure, adding to the general atmosphere of anxiety and dread. In such times, people turned more fervently than ever to their faith, seeking comfort in familiar rituals and ancient traditions. Dancing was an integral part of these celebrations, from the elaborate court dances, performed by the nobility with their precise steps and graceful movements, the bassadanza, a stately dance favored by the wealthy burghers, emphasized restraint and dignity, while the peasant dances celebrated the harvest or the coming of spring with wild, energetic movements that released the tensions of hard-working lives. Music filled the air on festival days as minstrels wandered through the streets playing lutes. But as our tale unfolds, we shall see how this most natural and joyful of human expressions could become something altogether more sinister and strange. For now, though, let us simply rest in this vision of a medieval city going about its ancient business. So settle back into the comfort of your evening rest and let your mind drift to those distant streets where history holds its strangest secrets. Close your eyes, turn the page, and let history guide you to sweet dreams. But when morning came, when the first rays of sunlight crept through her small window, Frau Trophia rose again. Before her husband could stop her, before the neighbors could intervene, she was back in the street. Her swollen feet, her obvious pain, her exhaustion, none of these seemed to matter in the face of this overwhelming compulsion to dance. Word of her condition spread quickly through the narrow streets and winding alleyways of Strasbourg. By the third day, small crowds gathered regularly to witness this extraordinary and disturbing spectacle. Some came out of simple curiosity, drawn by the novelty of such strange behavior. Others came seeking signs and portents, believing that Frau Trofia's dancing might hold some message from the divine, or perhaps from darker forces. They spoke in solemn Latin, calling upon Saint Vitus, the patron saint often invoked in cases of what they termed dancing sickness, a malady that had appeared sporadically throughout the region in previous centuries. Still others came with genuine concern, hoping to find some way to help this suffering woman who seemed trapped in a nightmare of perpetual motion. They examined Frau Trofia as best they could while she continued her ceaseless movement, checking her pulse, observing her breathing, looking for signs of fever or other physical ailments. The local clergy arrived to offer prayers and blessings, sprinkling holy water upon the cobblestones where Frau Trofia continued her endless dance. But their prayers and their holy water seemed to have no effect upon the dancing woman, who continued her strange ritual as if completely unaware of their presence. First one, then another. Then several more citizens of Strasbourg found themselves overcome by the same irresistible urge to dance. Physicians, too, came to observe, bringing with them the accumulated wisdom of centuries of medical knowledge, but of movement, something that threatened to spread like wildfire through the entire population of the city. Some diagnosed an excess of hot blood in keeping with the medical theories of their time, while others suggested that the summer heat had affected her brain, causing this peculiar behavior. Nor could they suggest any treatment that might bring relief to the tormented woman. As the days passed, something even more disturbing began to occur. Others who had watched Frau Trofia's dancing began to show similar symptoms. What had begun as the isolated and tragic case of a single woman was becoming something far more alarming. The stage was set for one of history's most extraordinary and mysterious epidemics, a plague not of disease in any conventional sense. Chapter 2. The first dancer emerges. July 14th, 1518, dawned much like any other summer morning in the city of Strasbourg. The sun climbed slowly over the red-tiled rooftops. Merchants were already arranging their wares in the marketplace, while the aroma of fresh bread drifted from the baker's ovens, mixing with the scent of hay and horses from the nearby stables. On a narrow street lined with half-timber-bird houses, their wooden beams dark with age, lived a woman known to history only as Frau Trofia. We know little of her daily life, her hopes, her struggles, or what thoughts occupied her mind as she rose that fateful morning. Perhaps she prepared the morning meal for her husband, as countless wives had done before her, breaking bread, pouring ale, narrow and tall, with rooms stacked one upon another like boxes carefully arranged. The ground floor likely served as a workshop or shop, while the family lived in the chambers above, where small windows let in precious light and the walls were thick enough to keep out the winter cold. But something on this particular morning was different. Something stirred within Frau Trofia, a compulsion strange and irresistible that would change not only her life but the life of an entire city. Without warning, without apparent cause, Frau Trofia stepped out into the narrow street and began to dance. Not the measured steps of a festival celebration, nor the graceful movements of a court dance, but something altogether more primitive, more urgent. Her feet moved of their own accord, tapping out a rhythm that only she could hear. The neighbors who witnessed this strange spectacle stopped their morning tasks and watched with growing bewilderment. Here was a respectable woman, a housewife known for her quiet demeanor, suddenly transformed into something they could not understand, pleading with her to stop this peculiar behavior and return to the safety of their home. But Frau Troffea seemed not to hear him, or if she heard, she could not or would not respond. Her eyes held a strange, distant quality. As the sun climbed higher in the summer sky, passersby stopped to stare, some crossing themselves in prayer or protection, others muttering about curses and supernatural forces that might have possessed this unfortunate woman. Children peeked out from doorways, their eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and fear, while their mothers pulled them back into the safety of their homes. As the morning wore on into afternoon, Frau Troffea's movements became more frantic, more desperate. Her simple dress became soaked with perspiration, and her breathing grew labored. Yet still she could not stop. The cobblestones beneath her feet began to show dark stains, where blood seeped from her tortured soles through the thin leather of her shoes. Yet on she danced, as if driven by some force beyond human understanding, beyond human endurance. The crowd that had gathered grew larger and more anxious as the hours passed. Some suggested sending for a physician, while others whispered of priests and holy water and the need for spiritual intervention. A few brave souls attempted to physically restrain her, to force her to cease this self-destructive behavior. But their efforts proved futile, for Frau Troffea possessed, in her dancing trance, a strength that seemed to come from some source far beyond her ordinary human limitations. As evening approached and the shadows grew long across the street, Frau Troffea finally collapsed. Her body, racked with exhaustion, twitched and trembled upon the stones, while concerned neighbors gathered around her, uncertain what to do or how to help. The city's physicians held urgent consultations in their guild hall, poring over ancient texts and debating the possible causes of this unprecedented outbreak. Some pointed to the recent poor harvests, suggesting that spoiled grain might have poisoned the bread, causing hallucinations and strange behavior. Others blamed the alignment of the planets or the phase of the moon, both believed to exert powerful influences over human behavior and health. A few more learned doctors recalled similar outbreaks from centuries past, documented in the chronicles of distant monasteries where entire communities had been seized by dancing frenzies. But none could agree on a definitive cause, much less on an effective treatment for this growing crisis. The original dancers had been moving for days without rest, their bodies pushed far beyond normal human endurance. Their feet were bloodied and raw, their clothes torn from the constant motion, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and dehydration. Some tried to eat while continuing to move, resulting in tragic scenes of choking and vomiting as their tortured bodies rejected any attempt at normal sustenance. Dozens of people, men and women, young and old, rich and poor, all moved in their own private circles, each following a rhythm that only they could hear. Meanwhile, the dancing continued without pause or mercy, the constant shuffling and stamping of feet mixed with the occasional cry or moan from the dancers, creating a symphony of madness that could be heard throughout the city. Within hours, or sometimes merely minutes, they would rise again, compelled by forces beyond their conscious control to resume their endless and destructive performance. The streets of Strasbourg echoed with the sound of countless feet beating out their irregular rhythms against the ancient cobblestones. The mayor and the city council held emergency sessions, trying to decide how to respond to this growing threat to public order and safety. Other clergy members suggested that demonic possession was the more likely cause, requiring urgent exorcism and spiritual intervention. Yet still, they could not or would not stop. No pattern could be discerned in who was affected. Rich merchants danced alongside poor laborers. Devout churchgoers were seized with the same compulsion as those known for their skeptical views. But even this precaution proved insufficient. Servants who brought news from the outside sometimes returned infected with the dancing madness, spreading the contagion into previously safe households. Young children remained largely unaffected, but adults of all ages and social classes fell victim to the strange contagion. Workshops stood empty as craftsmen abandoned their trades to escape the spreading epidemic. The city that had once prided itself on its prosperity and order was rapidly descending into chaos and desperation. Even the cathedral saw reduced attendance as citizens became afraid to gather in large groups where the dancing might suddenly erupt. More deaths followed quickly. Some dancers died from exhaustion, others from dehydration, still others from injuries sustained during their frantic movements. Others argued that such measures might only worsen the situation, or perhaps anger whatever supernatural forces might be responsible. Yet those already infected continued their relentless dance, stepping over and around their fallen companions, as if they were merely obstacles in their path. Food and water offered by concerned citizens was either ignored or knocked away by the frantic movements of the dancers. The first victim was an elderly woman whose heart simply could not withstand the physical stress of continuous dancing. She collapsed in the market square and, despite the efforts of physicians and priests, could not be revived. Sleep was impossible, even when exhaustion finally forced a dancer to collapse upon the stones. Their rest was brief and fitful. The stage was set for dramatic and perhaps misguided attempts to end the dancing plague that was rapidly consuming one of Europe's most prosperous cities. By the second week, the number of afflicted had grown to more than 30. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying. Those who watched longest appeared most susceptible to developing the condition themselves. This observation led some to theorize that the dancing was spread through what they called sympathetic resonance, a kind of invisible force that passed from dancer to observer. Some danced alone, their movements wild and unpredictable, while others seemed to respond to invisible partners, reaching out to embrace empty air or spinning as if held by ghostly hands. The noise was extraordinary. Normal business and commerce ground to a virtual halt as citizens either fled in terror or remained transfixed by the spectacle unfolding before their eyes. The city's leaders found themselves facing an unprecedented crisis. Some advocated for forcible restraint of the dancers, using chains and ropes to prevent their self-destructive behavior. The church authorities were equally divided. Bishop Wilhelm declared the dancing to be a divine punishment for the sins of the city, calling for public penance and prayer. Still others proposed that St. Vitus himself was calling his followers to dance in his honor, and that resistance to this calling would only bring greater misfortune. As the debate raged among the city's leaders, the dancing epidemic continued to spread. The only common thread seemed to be exposure to the sight of others dancing. Families began to keep their members indoors, boarding up windows and refusing to venture into the streets where the dancing continued. The economic impact was severe. Markets closed as vendors either joined the dancers or fled in fear. Food shortages began to develop as supply chains were disrupted and storage facilities were abandoned. By the third week of the outbreak, the death toll had begun. Her death only added to the growing panic and confusion that gripped the city. The sight of lifeless bodies lying among the still dancing survivors created a scene of such horror that even the most curious onlookers began to stay away. The authorities realized that desperate measures were required if the city was to survive this unprecedented crisis. A young woman, perhaps no more than 20 years, whose name has been lost to the passage of time, suddenly joined the endless dance in the very street where Trofia continued her tortured performance. The witnesses described her transformation as swift and terrifying. One moment she stood among the crowd of onlookers, her face creased with concern for the original dancer, and the next, her own feet had begun to move in that same inexplicable rhythm. Her family rushed forward to restrain her, but found themselves powerless against the strange compulsion that had seized their beloved daughter. She danced with wild abandon, her arms flailing, her head thrown back, as if listening to some celestial, or perhaps infernal, music that only she could hear. An elderly merchant, a middle-aged housewife, and a young apprentice from the blacksmith's shop, all suddenly and without warning began to move in that same frenzied manner. By the end of that same day, 3 more had joined the growing company of dancers. The pattern was always the same. First came the vacant stare, as if the person was seeing something far beyond the physical world around them. But none could agree on a definitive cause, much less on an effective treatment for this growing crisis. Their feet were bloodied and raw, their clothes torn from the constant motion, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and dehydration. Then the subtle movement of the feet, beginning almost imperceptibly, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Within hours, or sometimes merely minutes, they would rise again, compelled by forces beyond their conscious control to resume their endless and destructive performance. Dozens of people, men and women, young and old, rich and poor, all moved in their own private circles, each following a rhythm that only they could hear. Some tried to eat while continuing to move. The streets of Strasbourg echoed with the sound of countless feet beating out their irregular rhythms against the ancient cobblestones. Others blamed the alignment of the planets or the phase of the moon, both believed to exert powerful influences over human behavior and health. Others brought offerings of food and wine, believing that perhaps the dancers were possessed by spirits that might be appeased through such gestures. Within moments, the movement would intensify, becoming more urgent, more desperate, until the afflicted was caught in the full grip of the dancing compulsion. Other clergy members suggested that demonic possession was the more likely cause, requiring urgent exorcism and spiritual intervention. The crowds that gathered to witness these extraordinary events grew larger and more agitated with each passing day. Those who watched longest appeared most susceptible to developing the condition themselves. Workshops stood empty as craftsmen abandoned their trades to escape the spreading epidemic. Even the cathedral saw reduced attendance as citizens became afraid to gather in large groups where the dancing might suddenly erupt. She collapsed in the market square and, despite the efforts of physicians and priests, could not be revived. Yet those already infected continued their relentless dance, stepping over and around their fallen companions, as if they were merely obstacles in their path. This observation led some to theorize that the dancing was spread through what they called sympathetic resonance, a kind of invisible force that passed from dancer to observer. The constant shuffling and stamping of feet, mixed with the occasional cry or moan from the dancers, creating a symphony of madness that could be heard throughout the city. The stage was set for dramatic and perhaps misguided attempts to end the dancing plague that was rapidly consuming one of Europe's most prosperous cities. She danced with wild abandon, her arms flailing, her head thrown back as if listening to some celestial, or perhaps infernal, music that only she could hear, and a young apprentice from the blacksmith shop, all suddenly and without warning began to move in that same frenzied manner. More deaths followed quickly. Some dancers died from exhaustion, others from dehydration, still others from injuries sustained during their frantic movements. First came the vacant stare, as if the person was seeing something far beyond the physical world around them. Some came armed with holy relics and sacred symbols, hoping to ward off whatever evil might be responsible for this spreading madness. Others brought offerings of food and wine, believing that perhaps the dancers were possessed by spirits that might be appeased through such gestures. Then the subtle movement of the feet, beginning almost imperceptibly, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Within moments, the movement would intensify, becoming more urgent, more desperate, until the afflicted was caught in the full grip of the dancing compulsion. Devout churchgoers were seized with the same compulsion as those known for their skeptical views, and the next, her own feet had begun to move in that same inexplicable rhythm. The city's physicians held urgent consultations in their guild hall, poring over ancient texts and debating the possible causes of this unprecedented outbreak. A few more learned doctors recalled similar outbreaks from centuries past, documented in the chronicles of distant monasteries, where entire communities had been seized by dancing frenzies. But even this precaution proved insufficient. Meanwhile, the dancing continued without pause or mercy. The original dancers had been moving for days without rest, their bodies pushed far beyond normal human endurance. Yet still, they could not or would not stop. Food and water offered by concerned citizens was either ignored or knocked away by the frantic movements of the dancers. Sleep was impossible, even when exhaustion finally forced a dancer to collapse upon the stones. Their rest was brief and fitful. By the second week, the number of afflicted had grown to more than 30. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying. Some danced alone, their movements wild and unpredictable, while others seemed to respond to invisible partners, reaching out to embrace empty air or spinning as if held by ghostly hands. The noise was extraordinary. The city's leaders found themselves facing an unprecedented crisis. Some advocated for forcible restraint of the dancers, using chains and ropes to prevent their self-destructive behavior. The church authorities were equally divided. Bishop Wilhelm declared the dancing to be a divine punishment for the sins of the city, calling for public penance and prayer. Still others proposed that Saint Vitus himself was calling his followers to dance in his honor, and that resistance to this calling would only bring greater misfortune. As the debate raged among the city's leaders, the dancing epidemic continued to spread. No pattern could be discerned in who was affected. Rich merchants danced alongside poor laborers. The only common thread seemed to be exposure to the sight of others dancing. Families began to keep their members indoors, boarding up windows and refusing to venture into the streets where the dancing continued. The economic impact was severe. Markets closed as vendors either joined the dancers or fled in fear. Food shortages began to develop as supply chains were disrupted and storage facilities were abandoned. By the third week of the outbreak, the death toll had begun. Her death only added to the growing panic and confusion that gripped the city. The sight of lifeless bodies lying among the still dancing survivors created a scene of such horror that even the most curious onlookers began to stay away. The authorities realized that desperate measures were required if the city was to survive this unprecedented crisis. Within a week of Frau Trofia's first fateful steps, the dancing had claimed its second victim, a young woman, perhaps no more than 20 years, whose name has been lost to the passage of time, suddenly joined the endless dance in the very street where Trofia continued her tortured performance. The witnesses described her transformation as swift and terrifying. One moment she stood among the crowd of onlookers, her face creased with concern for the original dancer. By the end of that same day, 3 more had joined the growing company of dancers. The pattern was always the same. The crowds that gathered to witness these extraordinary events grew larger and more agitated with each passing day. Chapter 4. The authorities respond as the death toll mounted and the dancing showed no signs of abating. The city's authorities knew they could no longer remain passive observers to this extraordinary crisis. The mayor, Herr Jakob Sturm, convened an emergency council in the Great Hall of the city, bringing together the most learned men of Strasbourg to devise a solution to this unprecedented plague. Around the long oak table sat physicians trained in the ancient arts of Galen and Hippocrates, their faces grave with the weight of responsibility. Beside them, the clergy, in their dark robes, clutched leather-bound volumes of theological wisdom, while city councilmen worried over ledgers that showed the economic devastation spreading as quickly as the dancing itself. The debate that ensued would have seemed almost comical were it not for the desperate circumstances that had prompted it. He proposed that the dancing was caused by an imbalance of the 4 humors, specifically an excess of hot and moist blood that had heated the brain beyond its normal capacity. The treatment he suggested involved bloodletting and purging to remove the corrupted fluids from the dancers' bodies. Dr. Paracelsus, the city's most renowned physician, spoke first, his voice heavy with the authority of years spent studying the mysteries of the human body. If professional musicians could provide proper accompaniment, the dancers could be guided into more controlled movements that would gradually exhaust this supernatural energy and restore them to normal health. He argued that the dancing was clearly a manifestation of divine displeasure with the moral corruption that had crept into the city's spiritual life. Drummers, pipers, and lute players were instructed to position themselves around the various groups of afflicted citizens and provide musical accompaniment to their movements. After hours of debate, they voted to implement Heinrich's proposal immediately. Their previously erratic and individual movements suddenly synchronized, creating a grotesque ballet of dozens of people moving in terrible unison. He had consulted with the city's Guild of Musicians and had learned of historical precedents for treating dancing sickness through what he called exhaustion therapy. Only through prayer, fasting, and public penance could the citizens hope to appease the angry heavens and end this terrible affliction. Within days, carpenters had erected a large wooden platform in the grain market, complete with railings to prevent the dancers from injuring themselves by falling. The most severely afflicted dancers were carried or guided to the platform, where they could dance under the watchful eyes of physicians and clergy. Some spun endlessly in tight circles, their arms outstretched like human windmills. What had begun with simple drums and pipes expanded to include trumpets, viols, and even a small organ that had been wheeled out from one of the churches. Others leaped and bounded with superhuman energy, their feet barely touching the stage before launching into the air again. Father Bernhard, the cathedral's senior priest, shook his gray head vigorously at this purely physical explanation. The rhythm grew faster, more insistent, driving the dancers to even greater heights of frenzied activity. Citizens who had managed to avoid the dancing sickness thus far found themselves unable to escape the sound, which seemed to penetrate every building and every corner of the urban landscape. The synchronized movements became more violent and more sustained. Dancers who might have collapsed from exhaustion when left to their own devices now found themselves supported. Their fellow musicians watched in horror as colleagues transformed from healers into victims before their eyes, and encouraged by the relentless rhythm of the professional musicians. But the city council, having committed significant resources to the effort, insisted that more time was needed to judge its effectiveness. Some physicians began treating dancers with traditional methods of bloodletting and herbal remedies, while others continued to support the musical approach. But it was Councilman Heinrich, a practical man of commerce, who proposed the solution that would ultimately be adopted. The number of active dancers had grown to nearly 400, making it one of the largest outbreaks of dancing mania in recorded history. Dancers collided with each other, creating a chaotic melee of flailing limbs and desperate movements. The cathedral bells rang constantly, calling the faithful to special services and adding yet another layer of sound to the cacophony that had overwhelmed the city. The markets stood empty, workshops remained closed, and even essential services like bread making had been severely disrupted. Food shortages were becoming critical, and there were reports of looting and violence as desperate citizens competed for dwindling supplies. The combination of the wooden stage, which was harder and less forgiving than the cobblestones, and the more intense musical accompaniment proved fatal for many of the weaker dancers. This isolation only worsened the economic crisis and added to the growing sense that the city was trapped in a supernatural disaster from which there might be no escape. The authorities realized that their confident interventions had not only failed, but had transformed a mysterious affliction into a full-scale civic catastrophe that threatened the very survival of one of the Holy Roman Empire's most important cities. The sight of these shrouded forms, lying in neat rows while the dancing continued mere feet away, created an atmosphere of apocalyptic dread. The theory, simple yet seemingly logical, suggested that the dancers were compelled to move by an excess of rhythmic energy trapped within their bodies. Others barricaded themselves indoors, stuffing cloth into their ears and praying for deliverance from the nightmare that their prosperous city had become. Sleep was impossible. Normal conversation required shouting, and the constant noise had begun to affect the mental health of people who had thus far escaped the dancing sickness. The assembled council found this explanation more palatable than either the harsh medical treatments or the grim religious interpretations that had been offered. Playing for hours without break, exposed to the constant sight of human suffering, several reported experiencing strange symptoms. A few claimed to feel irresistible urges to abandon their instruments and join the dancers on the stage. The very next morning, the city hired a company of musicians to accompany the dancers. The result was both spectacular and horrifying. The moment the first drum beat echoed through the cobblestone streets, the dancers responded as if struck by lightning. The musicians, perhaps caught up in the strange atmosphere themselves, played with increasing fervor. What the authorities had intended as a therapeutic intervention had instead become a macabre festival of movement and sound that drew even larger crowds of frightened onlookers. The Guild of Musicians had also recommended constructing a proper stage, where the dancers could perform more safely than on the rough cobblestones. This stage quickly became the focal point of the entire epidemic. The sight was extraordinary and deeply disturbing. Dozens of people, ranging from wealthy merchants to common laborers, moved in desperate synchronization on the wooden planks. The music grew louder and more elaborate as additional musicians joined the effort. The cacophony could be heard throughout the city, a constant reminder of the crisis that had engulfed Strasbourg. Rather than curing the dancers, however, the musical treatment appeared to be making them worse. The death rate increased dramatically. Bodies began to accumulate around the edges of the platform, covered with rough canvas sheets, as families waited for permission to claim their dead. Some of the musicians themselves began to show signs of distress. 2 pipers and a drummer actually did succumb, setting down their instruments and climbing onto the platform to dance alongside those they had been hired to help. Dr. Paracelsus, observing these developments, declared the musical treatment a complete failure and demanded that it be discontinued immediately. This disagreement between medical and political authorities created additional chaos and confusion. The clergy, meanwhile, organized massive prayer sessions and processions, hoping to address what they still believed to be the spiritual dimension of the crisis. As the 4th week of the epidemic began, it became clear that the authorities' well-intentioned interventions had only made the situation worse. The wooden stage, originally designed to accommodate perhaps 50 people, was dangerously overcrowded. The sound of the music, now playing almost continuously day and night, had become a form of torture for the non-afflicted citizens. Some families abandoned their homes entirely, fleeing to relatives in neighboring villages or simply camping in the countryside until the crisis passed. The economic impact was now complete. All normal commerce had ceased. Neighboring cities began to impose quarantines on Strasbourg, refusing to allow travelers or goods from the affected area to cross their borders. As July turned to August, the stage was set for even more desperate measures. Chapter 5. The cure becomes the disease. The wooden stage creaked and groaned under the weight of nearly 200 dancers, their movements creating a thunderous cacophony that echoed through the empty market square like the beating of some monstrous heart. What had begun as a carefully planned therapeutic intervention had transformed into a grotesque spectacle that drew horrified onlookers from across the region. Travelers passing through Strasbourg stopped to witness what many described as a vision of hell itself brought to earth. Their eyes had taken on the same distant quality as the dancers, and several had begun to sway in rhythm with their own music, seemingly on the verge of abandoning their instruments to join the frenzied mass of bodies on the stage. Within hours, 3 more musicians had joined the dancers, leaving gaps in the carefully orchestrated accompaniment that made the remaining music sound broken and discordant. The musicians, exhausted from days of continuous playing, began to show signs of madness themselves. He had been documenting the progression of the epidemic in his medical journals, noting that the musical treatment had not only failed to cure the original dancers, but had actually accelerated the spread of the condition, as if the compulsion had become so deeply embedded in their nervous systems that it persisted even during sleep. With most of the markets closed and trade routes disrupted, citizens were beginning to hoard what little bread and grain they could find. Fights broke out in the few shops that remained open, and there were reports of desperate families breaking into abandoned homes in search of food. Their feet, worn down to bloody stumps, left dark stains on the wooden stage. The great merchant houses that had made Strasbourg prosperous now shuttered their windows and waited for the madness to pass. Several had developed severe infections that spread up their legs, while others showed symptoms of what appeared to be brain fever. In the middle of a particularly intense passage, he suddenly threw down his drumsticks and leaped onto the platform. Many had died in twisted positions, their limbs locked in the final poses of their fatal dance. Traditional burial shrouds could not accommodate these contorted forms, forcing the gravediggers to construct special coffins, or, in some cases, to bury the dead in mass graves. The constant prayers, the endless requests for divine intervention, and the sight of so much human suffering had begun to take a toll on his own mental state. Several teachers noted that some children had begun to move their feet rhythmically under their desks, mimicking the movements they had observed in the afflicted adults. Many had watched their loved ones dance themselves to death, helpless to intervene, and the psychological toll of these experiences had left entire households in states of deep depression and despair. Father Bernhard reported that attendance at services had dropped dramatically, not because faith had diminished, but because people were afraid to leave their homes. Many had watched their parents or older siblings succumb to the madness, and the trauma of these experiences manifested in various ways. Some neighborhoods organized their own defense groups, armed with kitchen knives and farming tools, to protect their families and property from roving bands of looters. Farmers, who had depended on the city's markets for their livelihood, found themselves with no outlet for their produce. Some attempted to set up temporary markets in nearby villages, but fear of the dancing contagion kept most potential customers away. With so many officials either dead, fled, or incapacitated, basic services like waste removal and street maintenance had ceased entirely. This disruption had cascading effects throughout the Rhine Valley, causing economic hardship in communities that had never experienced the dancing sickness directly. Some children stopped speaking entirely, while others suffered from nightmares and refused to sleep. Those who did attend often became distracted by the constant sound of music and dancing that penetrated even the thick stone walls of the church. The wooden stage, now stained with blood and littered with the personal effects of dancers who had collapsed and died, had become a monument to the failure of human understanding in the face of inexplicable phenomena. They had become pure motion, pure rhythm, as if everything that had once made them individuals had been burned away by the relentless fire of the dance. A cautionary tale told in whispers by travelers who remembered when it had been a thriving center of commerce and culture. Armed guards were posted on all major roads leading to the city, with orders to turn back any travelers attempting to enter or leave the afflicted area. Stray dogs and rats moved freely through the abandoned districts, and the smell of decay began to permeate areas that had once been models of medieval urban planning. However, they served to formalize the isolation that had already made Strasbourg a pariah in the region. Weeks of continuous movement, had stripped away not only their physical health, but also, it seemed, their personalities and memories. Several priests reported nightmares in which they themselves were dancing, unable to stop, while demonic figures played hellish music that never ended. But because there was no one left to arrest criminals or conduct trials, his fellow musicians watched in horror as their leader began to dance with the same desperate energy as those he had been hired to cure. The city's burial grounds, normally quiet places where families came to mourn their departed, became scenes of constant activity as gravediggers worked around the clock to keep pace with the mounting casualties. Master Wilhelm, the lead drummer whose steady beats had initially seemed to organize the chaos, was the first to succumb. This defection created a domino effect among the remaining performers. Dr. Paracelsus, observing these developments from the relative safety of a nearby balcony, declared the entire enterprise a catastrophic failure. The physician's detailed observations revealed disturbing patterns. Dancers who had been moving for more than 2 weeks were beginning to exhibit signs of permanent physical damage. Most troubling of all were the reports from family members who claimed that even in their brief moments of unconsciousness, the dancers continued to move their limbs rhythmically. The city's food supplies were now critically low. The economic collapse was complete. The guild halls stood empty, their members either afflicted with the dancing sickness or fled to neighboring towns. Even the cathedral began to show signs of strain. The priest himself had begun to suffer from what he described as spiritual exhaustion. More disturbing still were the reports from other clergy members who claimed to have experienced strange dreams and visions. As August progressed, the death toll mounted steadily. The bodies of the dancers presented unique challenges for burial. The families of the deceased were often too traumatized to perform proper funeral rites. Children were particularly affected by the crisis, even though they seemed largely immune to the dancing sickness itself. The few schools that remained open reported that students were unable to concentrate on their lessons, distracted by the constant sound of music and dancing from outside. Social order continued to deteriorate as the traditional power structures of the city broke down. The narrow streets, once kept clean by civic pride and municipal regulation, became littered with refuse and human waste. The legal system had effectively collapsed as well. Courts could not convene without judges and magistrates, and the city's jail stood empty, not because crime had ceased. This breakdown of law and order led to increased incidents of theft and violence as desperate citizens competed for dwindling resources. The surrounding countryside began to feel the effects of Strasbourg's collapse as well. Regional trade networks that had operated efficiently for centuries began to break down as merchants rerouted their caravans to avoid the afflicted city. By the end of August, neighboring cities had established formal quarantine barriers around Strasbourg. These quarantine measures were largely unnecessary, as few people had any desire to enter a city that had become synonymous with madness and death. Inside the quarantine zone, the situation continued to deteriorate. The remaining musicians, those who had somehow resisted the compulsion to join the dancers, played on with mechanical determination, their music now sounding more like a funeral dirge than any attempt at therapeutic intervention. The dancers themselves, those who still survived, had been transformed into something barely recognizable as human. Many no longer responded to their own names or showed any recognition of family members who called out to them. As September approached with the crisis now in its 7th week, even the most optimistic observers began to wonder. if Strasbourg would survive this mysterious plague, or if it would become just another abandoned city. The stage was set for the final act of this extraordinary drama, though none could predict whether it would end in redemption or utter catastrophe. Chapter 6: The Pilgrimage of Desperation. By the first week of September, with nearly 400 souls trapped in the relentless grip of the dancing madness, the city authorities made a decision born of pure desperation. If human medicine had failed, if musical therapy had only worsened the crisis, then perhaps divine intervention offered the only remaining hope for salvation. Father Bernhard, his face gaunt from weeks of sleepless prayer and his hands trembling with exhaustion, proposed what many considered a final gamble. The dancers, he declared, must be taken on pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus, located in a small chapel in the hills outside the city. Throughout the centuries, sufferers from similar afflictions had journeyed to his various shrines seeking relief from their tormented movements. Saint Vitus, the young Christian martyr who had been tortured and killed during the reign of Emperor Diocletian, was widely believed to have power over what medieval physicians called choriomania, or dancing sickness. The shrine near Strasbourg was a modest affair, little more than a stone chapel built into the side of a hill where, according to local legend, the saint had once appeared to a shepherd boy. The chapel contained a wooden statue of Vitus, carved centuries earlier by unknown hands, and a small pool of spring water that was said to possess miraculous healing properties. At the front, Father Bernhard carried a silver crucifix, while a small choir of priests chanted Latin prayers. Arms and legs protruded from the wagon beds, moving constantly in the air like the limbs of overturned insects. Some dancers had to be tied down to prevent them from throwing themselves from the moving vehicles, while others seemed barely conscious, their movements reduced to faint twitching motions. Behind them came the wagons, each one carrying 6 to 8 dancers who continued their rhythmic movements even while lying flat on their backs. Most crossed themselves and hurried their children indoors, fearful that the dancing madness might somehow spread to their own families. A few brave souls offered water and food to the pilgrims, but even these acts of charity were performed at a careful distance. The wagons became mired repeatedly, requiring teams of men to push and pull them free, while the dancers continued their movements in the growing downpour. Some carried bundles of personal belongings, as if they were fleeing the city permanently, rather than merely making a pilgrimage. The small chapel, which normally saw perhaps a dozen visitors per month, was suddenly surrounded by hundreds of desperate souls seeking a miracle. A few became more agitated, their movements growing even more frantic as the water soaked through their clothing. Families dragged their dancing relatives from the wagons and carried them into the chapel, where they were laid before the wooden statue of the saint. Some wept openly, while others maintained a stoic silence, their faces marked by the strain of weeks spent watching their loved ones suffer. Some of the dancers continued their movements even while prostrate on the cold stone floor, creating a bizarre spectacle of worship and madness. Others appeared to calm slightly, as if the cool moisture provided some relief from the fever that had consumed them for so long. The spring water, gathered carefully in small cups and given to the dancers to drink, appeared to have no more effect than ordinary well water. He could see that the pilgrimage had failed in its primary purpose, that the dancers were no better than when they had arrived, and that several more had died during the evening's ceremonies. Several died during the journey, their bodies finally succumbing to the weeks of abuse they had endured. The dancers could not remain at the shrine indefinitely, as there was no shelter adequate for so many people, and winter was approaching rapidly. Some still believed that more time at the shrine might produce the desired miracle, while others had already begun to accept that their loved ones were beyond any earthly or divine help. These casualties were wrapped in rough canvas and loaded onto a separate wagon that served as a traveling morgue. Dark clouds gathered overhead, and a cold wind began to blow from the north, carrying with it the promise of an early autumn storm. The dancers continued their relentless movements, seemingly unaffected by the holy surroundings or the fervent prayers offered on their behalf. Holy water was sprinkled liberally over the dancers, while incense filled the small space with its sweet, heavy smoke. Others bore offerings for the saint: bread, wine, silver coins, and precious objects that represented their families' entire wealth. Wagons were commandeered from throughout the city, their usual cargo of grain and goods replaced with straw pallets to cushion the tortured bodies of the dancers. Their families and their own sanity would survive the mysterious curse that had transformed their peaceful lives into an endless nightmare of movement and despair. One woman threw herself upon the statue of Saint Vitus, clawing at the wooden figure and demanding that the saint cure her daughter. Others began to flagellate themselves, believing that their own suffering might somehow purchase divine intervention. Many of the afflicted could barely stand, let alone walk the 15 miles to the shrine. Others continued their frantic movements with such violence that restraining them for transport seemed impossible. The logistics of transporting several hundred dancing invalids through the countryside presented enormous challenges. Master Heinrich, the councilman who had originally proposed the musical cure, now found himself organizing what amounted to a massive evacuation. The procession that formed on the morning of September 8th was unlike anything witnessed in the region's long history. The sight was both pathetic and terrifying. Following the wagons came hundreds of family members, their faces marked by weeks of anguish and sleepless nights. The procession moved slowly through the countryside, stopping frequently to tend to dancers who had injured themselves or fallen unconscious. Local villagers came out to watch the strange parade pass through their communities. The weather, which had been fair for weeks, began to turn as the procession made its way into the hills. By afternoon, rain had begun to fall steadily, turning the dirt roads into treacherous streams of mud. The rain seemed to have a strange effect on some of the afflicted. As evening approached, the exhausted procession finally reached the shrine of Saint Vitus. The scene that unfolded was one of medieval piety mixed with pagan desperation. Father Bernhard began the formal ceremonies, reading from ancient texts that described the proper rituals for invoking Saint Vitus's healing power. The families joined in desperate prayers, their voices rising and falling in a cacophony of Latin, German, and local dialects. But as the hours passed, it became clear that no miraculous cure was forthcoming. Some family members, driven to the edge of sanity by this final disappointment, began to act in increasingly desperate ways. The wooden statue, worn smooth by centuries of touching hands and desperate kisses, seemed to stare down at the chaos with the same serene expression it had worn since the day it was carved. As midnight approached, Father Bernhard faced the most difficult decision of his ecclesiastical career. The families looked to him for guidance, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and growing despair. The priest gathered the community leaders in a corner of the chapel and spoke in hushed, tones about the practical realities they faced. Yet returning to Strasbourg meant admitting that their final hope had been exhausted, that they had no choice but to accept whatever fate awaited them back in the afflicted city. As the rain continued to fall on the roof of the chapel, creating a steady drumbeat that fumed to echo the rhythm of the dancers' movements, the future of Strasbourg and its people hung in the balance. Desperate gamble, and like all their previous attempts to end the dancing plague, it had failed to provide the salvation they so desperately sought. Perhaps new disasters, but for now, the exhausted pilgrims could only huddle in the small chapel and wonder if their city. Chapter 7: The Return to Ruins. The journey back to Strasbourg began at dawn on September 10th, under skies heavy with the promise of more rain and the weight of crushed hopes. The pilgrims who had arrived at the shrine filled with desperate faith now faced the grim reality that their last refuge had offered no salvation. The wooden statue of Saint Vitus, which had watched over centuries of suffering souls, had remained silent in the face of their most fervent prayers. Father Bernhard led the procession back down the muddy hill roads, his silver crucifix now tarnished, and his vestments stained with the grime of their failed pilgrimage. Behind him, the wagons carried the same burden they had brought to the shrine, though several were noticeably lighter, their human cargo reduced by death during the night. The dancers themselves seemed unchanged by their encounter with the sacred. If anything, some appeared more agitated than before, as if the interruption to their routine had somehow intensified their compulsion rather than relieved it. The return journey was marked by a profound silence that spoke louder than any lamentation. Family members walked beside the wagons with downcast eyes, no longer offering words of encouragement to their afflicted relatives. The hope that had sustained them through weeks of horror had finally been extinguished. Several families made the decision during that long walk not to return to Strasbourg at all. They broke away from the main procession at crossroads, heading toward distant relatives in other towns, or simply disappearing into the countryside with whatever possessions they could carry. One elderly merchant, whose wife had been among the first to join Frau Trophia in her cursed dance, was seen walking steadily eastward, while his wife continued her movements in a wagon heading west. He had apparently decided that he could no longer bear to witness her suffering and chose instead to begin a new life elsewhere, leaving behind 40 years of marriage and a lifetime of accumulated wealth. The rain that had begun during their pilgrimage continued almost without pause, turning the return journey into a miserable ordeal of mud, cold, and despair. The dancers, exposed to the elements in their open wagons, developed fevers and chills that added new dimensions to their suffering. By the time the bedraggled procession reached the outskirts of Strasbourg, word had already spread throughout the city that the pilgrimage had failed. Those citizens who had remained behind watched from their windows as the wagons rolled through streets that seemed even more desolate than when they had left. The wooden stage in the market square stood empty, its blood-stained planks now warped from exposure to the rain. The musical instruments that had been abandoned by their players lay scattered around the platform, like the remnants of some grotesque celebration that had ended in catastrophe. The few shops that had remained open during the pilgrimage had now closed their doors permanently. Their owners had either fled the city or simply given up any pretense of normal commerce in the face of the continuing crisis. Dr. Paracelsus, who had remained in the city to tend to other patients, met the returning procession with a report that dashed any remaining hopes for a normal resumption of life. During the 2 days of the pilgrimage, he informed them, 3 more citizens had spontaneously begun dancing, despite having no contact with the original afflicted group. This news suggested that the contagion had somehow taken root in the very atmosphere of the city itself, that Strasbourg had become a place where the dancing madness could arise spontaneously, without warning, transforming ordinary citizens into victims of the inexplicable plague. The dancers were returned to their families, though many households could no longer provide adequate care for their afflicted members. Weeks of maintaining constant vigilance had exhausted the emotional and physical resources of even the most devoted relatives. Some families, driven beyond the limits of human endurance, made the heartbreaking decision to abandon their dancing relatives to whatever fate awaited them. These unfortunate souls were left in the market square, where they continued their movements among the ruins of what had once been the city's commercial heart. The sight of these abandoned dancers, moving endlessly among puddles of rainwater and piles of rotting refuse, created a vision of human misery that seemed to embody all the suffering that had befallen the once prosperous city. The municipal government, such as it was, attempted to maintain some semblance of order by organizing the distribution of what little food remained in the city's stores. But these efforts were hampered by the fact that several city officials had themselves fallen victim to the dancing plague during the weeks of crisis. Mayor Sturm, who had initially convened the emergency council that approved the musical treatment, was among those who had succumbed to the contagion. He was discovered one morning in his private chambers, having apparently begun dancing sometime during the night, his official robes torn and his mayoral chain of office tangled around his ankles. The discovery of the mayor's condition sent shockwaves through what remained of the city's leadership. If even the highest officials were not safe from the mysterious affliction, then perhaps no one could be considered immune to its influence. This realization led to a mass exodus from the city, as those who still possessed the means to travel packed their belongings and fled to more distant locations. Entire neighborhoods, emptied as families abandoned homes that had been passed down through generations, choosing exile over the risk of falling victim to the dancing madness. The economic consequences of this exodus were immediate and severe. Property values collapsed completely, as there were no buyers for houses in a city that had become synonymous with supernatural terror. Merchants who had invested their entire fortunes in Strasbourg real estate found themselves suddenly penniless, their wealth transformed overnight into worthless claims on abandoned buildings. The guild system that had regulated trade and craftsmanship for centuries simply ceased to function. Guild halls stood empty, their elaborate ceremonies and traditional hierarchies rendered meaningless by the departure or death of most of their members. Even the cathedral began to show signs of abandonment. Father Bernhard, his faith severely tested by the failure of the pilgrimage, struggled to maintain regular services with a congregation that had dwindled to fewer than a dozen faithful souls. The great bells that had once marked the hours for the entire city now rang irregularly, sometimes not at all, as the bell ringers had either fled or fallen victim to the plague. The absence of these familiar sounds added to the sense that Strasbourg was gradually dying, its heartbeat growing fainter with each passing day. By the end of September, the number of active dancers had decreased significantly, though not because any cure had been discovered. Death had finally claimed many of those who had been afflicted longest, their bodies unable to sustain the relentless physical demands of continuous movement. The survivors, those who had somehow endured weeks of dancing, presented a tragic spectacle of human endurance, pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Many had lost the ability to speak coherently, while others seemed to have forgotten their own identities, responding only to the internal rhythms that continued to drive their movements. Dr. Paracelsus, in his continuing medical observations, noted that some of the longest-suffering dancers had developed a peculiar condition in which their movements had become so automatic that they appeared to be unconscious even while dancing. They moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes open but unseeing, their bodies following patterns that had become as involuntary as breathing. The physicians speculated that these individuals had somehow adapted to their condition, that their minds had found a way to escape the horror of their situation by retreating into a state of merciful unconsciousness while their bodies continued to perform the movements that they could not control. As October approached, bringing with it the first hints of winter cold, Strasbourg had been transformed from a thriving commercial center into something resembling a ghost town, populated by a handful of survivors and the remnants of the dancing plague that had destroyed their community. The stage was set for whatever final resolution awaited this extraordinary crisis, though few who remained in the city held any hope that it would be anything other than the slow extinction of a once great urban center. Chapter 8: The Slow Fade to Silence. October arrived in Strasbourg like a mourner dressed in gray, bringing with it the first sharp bite of winter and the gradual, inexorable end of one of history's most mysterious epidemics. The dancing plague that had consumed the city for nearly 3 months was not destined to end with dramatic revelation or miraculous intervention, but rather to fade away like a fever breaking in the cool dawn air. The transformation was subtle at first, noticed only by those few souls who had remained in the city to witness its slow resurrection. Dr. Paracelsus, maintaining his vigil despite the personal risks, was among the first to document what he cautiously described as a diminishment in the intensity of the affliction. The dancers who had survived the pilgrimage and the long weeks that followed were showing signs of what the physician termed gradual remission. Their movements, while still compulsive, had become less violent, less destructive to their own bodies. Where once they had leaped and spun with supernatural energy, they now moved in slower, more measured patterns. Their faces, gaunt from months of suffering, began to show occasional moments of awareness, brief glimpses of the personalities that had been buried beneath the dancing compulsion. Frau Trophia herself, the original victim whose first steps had begun this entire catastrophe, was among those showing the most dramatic improvement. On October 15th, exactly 3 months after her ordeal had begun, she was observed sitting quietly on the steps of her house for nearly an hour before rising to resume her movements. It was the first time anyone had seen her at rest since that fateful July morning, and word of this development spread quickly through the largely empty streets of the city. Hope, that dangerous emotion that had been crushed so many times before, began to stir once again in the hearts of those who remained. The improvement was not universal, nor was it immediate. Many dancers continued their movements with the same relentless intensity they had shown for weeks. But gradually, one by one, they began to experience moments of stillness, brief respites from the compulsion that had dominated their lives. These moments of rest grew longer and more frequent as the days passed. A dancer might suddenly stop in the middle of a frenzied sequence and stand perfectly still for several minutes before resuming their movements. Others would collapse not from exhaustion, as had happened so often before, but seemingly from a sudden absence of the driving force that had kept them in motion. Dr. Paracelsus theorized that the approaching winter might be playing a role in the gradual recovery. The cooler temperatures and shorter days, he suggested, might be having a calming effect on whatever imbalance had caused the epidemic in the first place. Others attributed the improvement to divine intervention, arguing that the failed pilgrimage had nevertheless earned some measure of heavenly mercy for the suffering city. Father Bernhard, his faith slowly recovering from the devastating blow it had received, began to speak cautiously of the mysterious ways in which Providence operates. By the end of October, nearly half of the surviving dancers had ceased their movements entirely. They sat or lay in exhausted stupor, their bodies finally allowed to begin the long process of healing from months of abuse. The recovery process was painful and often incomplete. Many of the former dancers had suffered permanent damage to their feet and legs. Some would walk with pronounced limps for the rest of their lives, while others would never walk normally again. More troubling were the mental effects of their ordeal. Several of the recovered dancers appeared to have lost significant portions of their memory. They could not recall events from the months of their affliction, and sometimes seemed uncertain about their own identities or the identities of family members. A few displayed what Dr. Paracelsus described as melancholia of the deepest sort, a profound depression that seemed to stem from some unconscious awareness of what they had endured. These individuals, while no longer compelled to dance, showed little interest in resuming normal life and often spent their days staring vacantly at nothing. The gradual end of the dancing epidemic allowed the surviving citizens to begin assessing the full scope of the disaster that had befallen their city. The human cost was staggering. Historians estimate that between 400 and 500 people had been affected by the dancing plague, with a mortality rate approaching 40%. Entire families had been wiped out, not just by the dancing sickness itself, but by the secondary effects of starvation, disease, and despair that had accompanied the breakdown of social order. The city's population, which had stood at nearly 20,000 at the beginning of the summer, had been reduced to fewer than 12,000 souls. The economic devastation was equally severe. Most of the city's accumulated wealth had been lost through abandonment, destruction, or the desperate expenditure of resources during the crisis. The trade networks that had made Strasbourg prosperous had been permanently disrupted, as merchants had found alternative routes that bypassed the city entirely. Many of the skilled craftsmen who had formed the backbone of the city's economy had either died or fled, taking with them knowledge and techniques that had been passed down through generations. The guild system that had organized production and maintained quality standards had collapsed completely and would take decades to rebuild. The physical infrastructure of the city had also suffered severe damage. Buildings had been abandoned and left to deteriorate, roofs had leaked without repair, and the streets had become impassable in many areas due to the accumulation of refuse and debris. The cathedral, while still standing, showed signs of neglect that would require significant investment to repair. Several of its stained glass windows had been broken by stones thrown by desperate citizens, and water damage had affected some of the interior artwork. Perhaps most significantly, the social fabric that had held the community together had been torn beyond easy repair. The shared trauma of the dancing plague had created divisions and suspicions that would persist for generations. Some blamed the city's leaders for their inadequate response to the crisis, while others pointed fingers at specific families or social groups, suggesting that they had somehow brought the curse upon the community. These recriminations would poison civic life for years to come. The few merchants who began to return to the city in November found a dramatically changed place. The bustling markets and prosperous shops they remembered had been replaced by empty buildings and abandoned lots. The cheerful bustle of commercial activity had given way to an atmosphere of haunted quiet. Those citizens who had survived the epidemic and chosen to remain in Strasbourg often seemed like ghosts of their former selves. They moved through the streets with a careful, measured pace, as if afraid that too much enthusiasm or energy might somehow trigger a return of the dancing madness. Children who had witnessed the horror of the preceding months showed particular signs of lasting trauma. Many had developed an intense fear of music and dancing that would persist into their adult years. The traditional festivals and celebrations that had once marked the rhythm of community life were quietly abandoned, deemed too dangerous to risk. By December, when the first snows began to fall on the damaged city, the dancing plague of 1518 had essentially ended. The last few afflicted individuals had either recovered or died, and no new cases had appeared for several weeks. But the silence that settled over Strasbourg was not the peaceful quiet of a community at rest. It was the heavy silence of a place that had been fundamentally changed by forces beyond human understanding, where the very concept of normal life had been permanently altered by an encounter with the inexplicable. The stage was set for a slow and difficult process of rebuilding, both physical and psychological, that would determine whether Strasbourg could ever truly recover from its brush with one of history's most mysterious and devastating epidemics. Chapter 9. Echoes in the Historical Record. As we settle into the quiet aftermath of these extraordinary events, we must turn our attention to how history has remembered and tried to explain the dancing plague that consumed Strasbourg in that distant summer of 1518. The contemporary records, scattered across monastery chronicles, municipal documents, and personal letters, paint a picture that is both vivid and frustratingly incomplete. Medieval record-keeping, while meticulous in some respects, was often colored by the religious and philosophical assumptions of the time. The most detailed account comes from the pen of Sebastian Brandt, a local humanist scholar who witnessed the events firsthand and recorded his observations in a Latin manuscript that survived in the archives of the Strasbourg Cathedral. His description, written with the careful precision of a trained observer, provides our most reliable window into the daily progression of the epidemic. Brandt noted the strange uniformity of the dancers' movements, describing how individuals who had never met seemed to move in similar patterns, as if responding to some shared internal rhythm. He was particularly struck by the way the affliction seemed to spread through observation, writing that the eye itself became a vector for this most peculiar contagion. Medical texts from the period offer their own interpretations, heavily influenced by the humoral theory that dominated medieval medicine. Dr. Paracelsus himself left extensive notes on the case, preserved in the collection of the University of Basel, where he later taught. His analysis focused on what he called sympathetic resonance of the animal spirits, a theory that suggested the dancing was caused by an imbalance of invisible forces within the body that could be transmitted from person to person through prolonged visual contact. The church records provide yet another perspective, viewing the events through the lens of spiritual warfare and divine judgment. Bishop Wilhelm's official report to his superiors in Rome described the dancing plague as a manifestation of demonic influence, brought about by the moral corruption that he believed had crept into the city's spiritual life. More intriguingly, his report mentioned similar outbreaks that had occurred in other parts of the Holy Roman Empire during the preceding decades, suggesting that the Strasbourg epidemic was part of a larger pattern of such events that swept across medieval Europe. These earlier outbreaks, while smaller in scale, shared many characteristics with the Strasbourg case. In each instance, the dancing began with a single individual who was soon joined by others. The movements appeared to be involuntary and exhausting, and traditional medical and religious interventions proved largely ineffective. The monastery at Klingenthal, just outside Strasbourg, preserved accounts of a similar outbreak that had occurred in their community in 1374. nearly a century and a half before the events we have been examining. In that case, an entire convent of nuns had been affected, dancing continuously for days, until several died from exhaustion. These historical precedents suggest that dancing mania was a recurring phenomenon in medieval Europe, appearing sporadically in different communities over the course of several centuries. The Strasbourg outbreak was simply the largest and best documented of these mysterious epidemics. Modern historians have proposed various theories to explain these events, each reflecting the scientific and cultural assumptions of their own times. In the 19th century, when the power of suggestion and crowd psychology were first being studied systematically, scholars suggested that the dancing plagues were early examples of mass hysteria. This interpretation gained credibility as psychologists began to document similar cases of collective behavior in contemporary settings. Factory workers who simultaneously developed mysterious symptoms, school children who experienced shared delusions, and religious communities that engaged in ecstatic dancing all seemed to follow patterns similar to those observed in medieval Europe. The theory of mass hysteria suggested that the dancing plagues began with individuals who were already psychologically vulnerable due to stress, malnutrition, or social pressure. Their unusual behavior then triggered a kind of psychological contagion that spread to others who were similarly predisposed. This explanation had the advantage of fitting the observed patterns while remaining within the bounds of scientific rationality. It could account for the seemingly supernatural aspects of the outbreaks, while locating their ultimate cause in understandable human psychology. However, other scholars found this explanation inadequate to explain the sheer physical endurance displayed by the dancers. The ability to move continuously for days or weeks, they argued, suggested something more than mere psychological suggestion. In the 20th century, as knowledge of neurological conditions advanced, some researchers proposed that the dancing plagues might have been caused by ergot poisoning. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, contains alkaloids that can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and involuntary muscle movements when consumed in significant quantities. This theory gained support when historians discovered that the summer of 1518 had been preceded by a particularly wet spring, conditions that would have favored the growth of ergot on grain crops. The symptoms of ergot poisoning, moreover, matched many aspects of the dancing plague, including the involuntary movements and the apparent inability to control one's actions. The ergot theory also provided an explanation for why the epidemic eventually ended. As the contaminated grain supplies were exhausted and replaced with fresh harvests, the level of toxins in the food supply would have decreased, allowing the affected individuals to gradually recover. Yet this explanation too had its limitations. Ergot poisoning typically affects the extremities first, causing gangrene and the loss of fingers and toes, symptoms that were not widely reported among the Strasbourg dancers. Moreover, ergot poisoning usually affects entire households that share the same food supply, while the dancing plague seemed to spread through visual contact rather than shared meals. More recent research has focused on the social and economic conditions that preceded the outbreak. The years immediately before 1518 had been marked by crop failures, political instability, and social upheaval throughout the region. Some historians argue that these stresses created a psychological environment in which collective delusions could flourish. People who were already struggling with hunger, uncertainty, and fear might have been particularly susceptible to the kind of mass hysteria that manifested as compulsive dancing. This interpretation emphasizes the dancing plague as a symptom of broader social dysfunction, a way for communities to express anxieties and tensions that could not be articulated through normal channels. The choice of dancing as the form of expression might have been influenced by cultural associations between dance and religious ecstasy, or by folk beliefs about supernatural possession. Still, other scholars have looked to anthropological studies of similar phenomena in other cultures. Trance dancing, possession rituals, and ecstatic religious practices are found in societies around the world, suggesting that the capacity for such states might be a fundamental aspect of human psychology. From this perspective, the medieval dancing plagues represent the spontaneous emergence of trance states in communities that lacked formal religious or cultural frameworks for channeling such experiences. The dancers might have been accessing genuine altered states of consciousness, but without the social structures that would normally guide and contain such experiences. The anthropological approach also helps explain why children seemed largely immune to the dancing contagion. In most cultures that practice ritual trance dancing, participants undergo extensive preparation and training before they are considered ready for such intense spiritual experiences. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that the dancing plague of 1518 remains, even today, fundamentally mysterious. Each proposed explanation captures certain aspects of the phenomenon while failing to account for others. The ergo theory explains the physical symptoms but not the pattern of contagion. The mass hysteria theory accounts for the psychological aspects but struggles with the extreme physical endurance of the dancers. The social stress theory provides context, but cannot explain why this particular form of collective behavior emerged at this specific time and place. What we can say with certainty is that the dancing plague represented a moment when the normal boundaries of human experience were temporarily suspended, when an entire community found itself confronting forces that lay beyond their understanding or control. The careful records kept by medieval chroniclers allow us to witness this extraordinary event, but they also remind us of how much about human behavior and consciousness remains mysterious, even in our supposedly enlightened age. As we prepare to close this strange chapter of history, we might reflect on how the citizens of Strasbourg struggled to maintain their humanity in the face of inexplicable circumstances, and how their story continues to challenge our assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Chapter 10: The Lasting Shadow. In the years that followed the dancing plague, Strasbourg slowly rebuilt itself from the ashes of that terrible summer, but the city that emerged was forever changed by its encounter with the inexplicable. The process of recovery was neither swift nor complete. Families that had lost loved ones to the dancing madness carried their grief like invisible wounds that never fully healed. Children who had witnessed the horror grew into adults who flinched at the sound of music and avoided public gatherings where people might begin to move in rhythm. The economic reconstruction took nearly a decade. Trade routes that had been disrupted during the crisis were gradually re-established, but Strasbourg never fully regained its position as a major commercial center. Merchants continued to view the city with suspicion, and many preferred to conduct their business in neighboring towns that had not been touched by supernatural calamity. The guild system was eventually restored, but it operated under new rules designed to prevent the kind of social breakdown that had occurred during the epidemic. Guild meetings were kept small and formal, with strict protocols that discouraged any activities that might lead to group hysteria or collective excitement. The city's leaders implemented what they called precautionary measures against future outbreaks. Public dancing was severely restricted, with licenses required for any musical performances in the marketplace. The wooden stage that had been constructed during the epidemic was dismantled, and the site was converted into a memorial garden where families could mourn their lost relatives in quiet dignity. Even religious observances were modified to reduce the risk of triggering another outbreak. The elaborate processions and festivals that had once marked the church calendar were scaled back or eliminated entirely. The cathedral's bells were rung on a more restrained schedule, and congregational singing was discouraged during services. These measures reflected a community that had lost confidence in its ability to predict or control human behavior. The dancing plague had demonstrated that ordinary citizens could be transformed, without warning, into something unrecognizable and dangerous. Dr. Paracelsus, who had observed the epidemic from beginning to end, became something of a celebrity in medical circles throughout Europe. His detailed notes on the case were copied and circulated among physicians in distant universities, where they were studied as examples of mass psychological phenomena. He established what was perhaps the first systematic approach to understanding crowd psychology, developing theories about how emotions and behaviors could spread through populations like infectious diseases. His work influenced generations of physicians and natural philosophers who sought to understand the mysterious connections between mind and body. But even Paracelsus admitted, in his later writings, that the dancing plague had left him humbled by the limits of human knowledge. Despite his careful observations and detailed theories, he acknowledged that the fundamental cause of the epidemic remained as mysterious as it had been on that first July morning when Frau Trophia began to dance. The survivors of the plague carried their own burdens in the years that followed. Many of those who had danced reported persistent problems with memory and concentration. Some described feeling as though part of their personality had been permanently altered by their experience, as if something essential had been lost during those weeks of involuntary movement. A few former dancers developed what physicians called phantom rhythms, the sensation that they could still feel the compulsive urge to move even years after their recovery. These individuals lived in constant fear that the dancing madness might return, and many chose to live as recluses rather than risk exposure to situations that might trigger another episode. Family relationships that had been strained during the crisis often never fully recovered. Spouses who had watched their partners dance themselves nearly to death found it difficult to trust in the stability of their marriages. Children who had seen their parents transformed into strangers struggled to rebuild emotional bonds that had been severed by trauma. The social fabric of Strasbourg, once tight-knit and cohesive, remained fragmented for decades. Neighbors who had blamed each other for bringing the curse upon the community nursed grudges that poisoned civic life. Political factions emerged based on different interpretations of what had caused the epidemic and how it should have been handled. Some citizens advocated for stricter religious observance, believing that moral purification would prevent future divine punishments. Others pushed for more rational, scientific approaches to public health, arguing that superstition and religious hysteria had made the crisis worse than it needed to be. These debates reflected broader changes that were occurring throughout European society as the Renaissance brought new ways of thinking about natural phenomena and human behavior. The dancing plague of Strasbourg became a touchstone in discussions about the relationship between faith and reason, between individual responsibility and collective action. Universities across the continent began to study the case as an example of how communities could be overwhelmed by forces they did not understand. The epidemic became a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass psychology and the importance of maintaining social order in times of crisis. Writers and artists found inspiration in the story of the dancing plague, creating works that explored themes of madness, possession, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. The image of hundreds of people dancing uncontrollably in the streets became a powerful metaphor for the breakdown of social norms and the fragility of human reason. Some of these artistic interpretations focused on the individual tragedy of the dancers themselves, portraying them as victims of forces beyond their control. Others emphasized the collective madness of the community, suggesting that the entire city had been complicit in creating the conditions that allowed the epidemic to flourish. The story of Strasbourg also influenced the development of public health policies in other cities. Municipal authorities throughout the Holy Roman Empire began to develop emergency protocols for dealing with mass psychological phenomena, recognizing that such outbreaks might occur again in the future. These protocols typically emphasize the importance of maintaining calm leadership, preventing the spread of panic, and avoiding interventions that might inadvertently worsen the situation. The failed musical therapy at Strasbourg became a standard example of how well-intentioned responses could backfire in unpredictable ways. Medical education was also transformed by the case. Future physicians were trained to recognize the signs of mass hysteria and to understand the complex relationships between psychological and physical symptoms. The dancing plague became a required case study in medical schools, used to teach students about the limitations of traditional diagnostic methods. Religious authorities too learned lessons from the Strasbourg epidemic. The failure of the pilgrimage to St. Vitus had raised difficult questions about the nature of divine intervention and the appropriate response to supernatural phenomena. Seminary training began to include instruction on how to distinguish between genuine spiritual experiences and psychological disorders. Perhaps most significantly, the dancing plague contributed to a gradual shift in how European society understood the relationship between individual and collective behavior. The epidemic had demonstrated that even rational, respectable citizens could be swept up in irrational collective actions under certain circumstances. This recognition influenced everything from legal systems, which began to consider the role of mass psychology in criminal cases, to political theory, which grappled with questions about the wisdom of democratic governance when crowds could be so easily manipulated. As the 16th century progressed, and the memory of the dancing plague began to fade, Strasbourg gradually recovered its prosperity and confidence. New generations grew up who had not witnessed the epidemic firsthand, and the city began to attract merchants and craftsmen who were not haunted by its dark history. But the records of those terrible weeks were carefully preserved in the cathedral archives, where they served as a reminder of how quickly the apparent solidity of civilization could dissolve into chaos. The dancing plague had taught the citizens of Strasbourg that they lived in a world where the impossible could become reality, without warning, where the boundaries between reason and madness were far more fragile than they had ever imagined. The shadows cast by those dancing figures would stretch across the centuries, influencing how subsequent generations understood the mysterious connections between mind and body, between individual psychology and collective behavior, between the known and the unknowable aspects of human experience. Chapter 11: Reflections on the Unknowable. As we reach the final moments of our journey through this extraordinary chapter of human history, we find ourselves confronting questions that extend far beyond the cobblestone streets of 16th century Strasbourg. The dancing plague forces us to examine the fundamental assumptions we make about the nature of reality, about the reliability of our senses, and about the boundaries that separate the possible from the impossible in human experience. Standing here, in our modern era, armed with centuries of scientific advancement and psychological understanding, we might be tempted to view the events of 1518 as quaint relics of a more superstitious age. Yet the deeper we probe into the historical record, the more we realize that our explanations remain as incomplete as those offered by the medieval physicians who first witnessed these events. Consider the sheer physical impossibility of what occurred. Human beings, under normal circumstances, simply cannot dance continuously for weeks without rest. The energy requirements alone should have killed the dancers within days, yet somehow they persisted, their bodies apparently accessing reserves of strength that conventional physiology insists do not exist. Our modern understanding of ergot poisoning, while compelling in some respects, fails to account for the precise synchronization of the dancer's movements, or the way the condition spread through visual contact rather than shared consumption of contaminated grain. The ergot theory, like all our rational explanations, captures fragments of the truth while the larger mystery remains intact. The mass hysteria hypothesis suffers from similar limitations. While we have documented many cases of collective psychological phenomena in contemporary settings, none approach the duration, intensity, or physical demands demonstrated by the Strasbourg dancers. We are left with the uncomfortable realization that our psychological theories, however sophisticated, may be inadequate to explain what actually occurred. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the dancing plague is how it challenges our assumptions about the nature of consciousness itself. The dancers appeared to be simultaneously present and absent, their bodies engaged in complex, coordinated movements, while their minds seemed to have retreated to some inaccessible realm. This suggests the possibility that human consciousness is far more fluid and mysterious than our neuroscientific models acknowledge. The dancing plague may have revealed aspects of the human psyche that remain largely hidden under normal circumstances, capacities for altered states of awareness that we have yet to fully understand or explain. The epidemic also raises profound questions about the relationship between individual and collective experience. The dancers were not simply isolated individuals suffering from the same condition. They formed a kind of collective entity, moving together in patterns that suggested some form of shared consciousness or group mind. This phenomenon challenges our Western emphasis on individual autonomy and separate identity. The dancing plague suggests that under certain circumstances, the boundaries between self and other may dissolve, creating forms of collective consciousness that our individualistic worldview struggles to comprehend. The failure of every attempted intervention during the epidemic is equally instructive. Neither medical treatment, musical therapy, nor religious intervention proved effective in stopping the dancing. This pattern suggests that the plague operated according to principles that lay outside the conceptual frameworks available to 16th century authorities. But perhaps more troubling is the realization that our contemporary frameworks might prove equally inadequate if faced with a similar phenomenon. Our hospitals, our psychological theories, our understanding of crowd control and mass communication might all prove useless against a force that operates by rules we do not yet comprehend. The dancing plague thus serves as a humbling reminder of the limits of human knowledge and control. Despite centuries of scientific progress, we remain vulnerable to forces that can transform ordinary life into something unrecognizable and terrifying without warning or explanation. This vulnerability is not merely an academic concern. Throughout history, human societies have been periodically overwhelmed by phenomena that seem to operate outside the boundaries of rational explanation. Epidemic diseases whose spread defied medical understanding, economic panics that followed no logical pattern, social movements that erupted spontaneously and reshaped entire civilizations. The dancing plague of Strasbourg represents one particularly vivid example of this larger category of inexplicable events that periodically disrupt the apparent stability of human civilization. It reminds us that beneath the surface of our ordered world lie forces that we neither understand nor control. Yet perhaps there is wisdom to be found in this acknowledgement of our limitations. The citizens of Strasbourg, who witnessed the dancing plague, were forced to confront the mystery of existence in its rawest form. They discovered that reality contains depths that cannot be fully mapped or controlled, and that human life unfolds within a larger context of unknowing. This recognition might have been terrifying, but it also opened up possibilities for humility, wonder, and a deeper appreciation for the mysterious nature of consciousness itself. The dancing plague stripped away the comfortable illusions of predictability and control, revealing the strange and wonderful reality that lies beneath our everyday assumptions about the world. The survivors of the epidemic carried this knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen ordinary people transformed into something beyond ordinary understanding, and they had witnessed the collapse and eventual restoration of their community. They knew, in a way that those who had not lived through such events could never know, that existence itself is far stranger and more precarious than it appears. This knowledge was both a burden and a gift. It made them more cautious, more aware of the fragility of the social bonds that hold communities together. But it also made them more appreciative of the moments of peace and normalcy that followed the crisis, more grateful for the simple gift of being able to move through the world under their own control. As we close this examination of the dancing plague, we might reflect on what lessons it offers for our own time. We live in an age that prides itself on rational understanding and scientific explanation, yet we too are vulnerable to forces that operate beyond our comprehension. Economic systems collapse without warning. Social movements spread through digital networks in ways that defy prediction, and individual behavior continues to surprise us even after decades of psychological research. The dancing plague reminds us that mystery remains an integral part of human experience, that our maps of reality will always contain vast territories marked unknown. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the dancing plague is the importance of maintaining humility in the face of the unknowable. The authorities of Strasbourg, who assumed they could control or cure the epidemic through conventional means, only made the situation worse. Their failure teaches us to approach mysterious phenomena with caution, respect, and an awareness of our own limitations. This does not mean abandoning rational inquiry or scientific investigation. The careful observations made by Dr. Paracelsus and other witnesses provide valuable insights into human behavior under extreme circumstances. But it does mean acknowledging that reason and science, however valuable, may not be sufficient to explain or control all aspects of human experience. The dancing plague of 1518 stands as a permanent reminder that we live in a world far stranger and more wonderful than our everyday experience suggests. It challenges us to remain open to possibilities that lie beyond our current understanding, while maintaining the humility to admit when we encounter phenomena that exceed our ability to explain. In the end, perhaps that is the most profound legacy of those long-dead dancers who moved through the streets of Strasbourg with such mysterious purpose. They remind us that existence itself is an extraordinary mystery, and that our brief passage through this world unfolds within dimensions of reality that we are only beginning to glimpse. Epilogue: The Last Dance. And so we reach the end of our journey through one of history's most enigmatic chapters. Though like all true mysteries, the dancing plague of Strasbourg resists any final resolution or complete understanding. As I close these worn volumes and dim the lamp that has illuminated our exploration of that distant summer, I find myself thinking of Frau Trophia, the woman whose first tentative steps began this entire extraordinary ordeal. What thoughts passed through her mind as she felt that initial, irresistible urge to move? Did she sense, in that moment, that she was about to unleash forces that would transform her entire community? We will never know. Her voice, like those of so many who lived through these events, has been lost to time. The records speak of her recovery, of the gradual return of stillness to her tormented body, but they tell us nothing of her inner experience. Nothing of how it felt to be the unwilling catalyst for such widespread suffering. Perhaps that silence is appropriate. Some experiences may be too profound, too alien to ordinary consciousness, to be captured in words. The dancing plague pushed its victims beyond the boundaries of normal human experience, into territories where language itself may become inadequate. What we can know, what the careful chroniclers of the time have preserved for us, is the shape of the mystery itself. We can trace the progression of the epidemic, document its effects on the community, and observe the desperate attempts to understand and control forces that seem to operate by their own inexplicable logic. In doing so, we glimpse something essential about the human condition. We see a community confronted with the impossible, struggling to maintain its dignity and humanity while everything familiar dissolved around them. We witness the failure of conventional wisdom and the courage of those who continued to care for the afflicted even when all hope seemed lost. The dancing plague also reveals the strange fragility of the world we take for granted. The merchants and craftsmen of Strasbourg went to sleep one July evening in a predictable universe, governed by comprehensible rules, and woke to find themselves in a place where those rules no longer applied. This transformation happened not through war or natural disaster, but through something far more unsettling, the spontaneous eruption of mystery into the heart of everyday life. It reminds us that the boundary between the normal and the extraordinary is thinner than we like to believe. Modern readers might find comfort in our contemporary explanations for the dancing plague, in our theories about ergot poisoning or mass hysteria. But if we are honest, we must admit that these explanations remain incomplete, that they illuminate some aspects of the phenomenon while leaving others in shadows as deep as ever. The true lesson of the dancing plague may be that some questions cannot be fully answered, that mystery remains an irreducible element of human existence. This is not a failure of inquiry or understanding, but rather a recognition of the limits within which all human knowledge operates. Those limits are not obstacles to be overcome, but boundaries that define the nature of our experience itself. We are creatures who live within mystery, who must navigate reality without ever fully comprehending the forces that shape our lives. The dancers of Strasbourg, in their uncontrolled movements and inexplicable suffering, may have been expressing something fundamental about the human condition itself. Perhaps we are all, in our quieter ways, dancers responding to rhythms we cannot hear, moved by forces we cannot name or understand. The records tell us that the dancing plague ended as mysteriously as it began, fading away like a fever broken by some internal logic of its own. The survivors returned to their ordinary lives, the city rebuilt itself, and the world moved forward as it always does, covering the traces of extraordinary events with the accumulating sediment of normal days. But for those who lived through the plague, for the families who lost loved ones, and the community that watched its foundations shake, the memory persisted. They had seen through the veil of ordinary reality to glimpse something beyond, something that revealed both the terror and the wonder of existence itself. That glimpse, preserved in the careful records we have examined, continues to challenge and humble us across the centuries. It reminds us that despite all our technological sophistication and scientific understanding, we remain as vulnerable as ever to forces that operate beyond our comprehension. This vulnerability is not a weakness, but a fundamental aspect of what it means to be human. We are beings who must live with uncertainty, who must find meaning and purpose within a reality that contains depths we may never fully plumb. The dancing plague of 1518 stands as a testament to both human fragility and human resilience. It shows us how quickly the familiar world can dissolve into chaos, but also how communities can endure even the most inexplicable trials, how love and care can persist even when understanding fails. As we close this examination of those long-ago events, we might pause to acknowledge the countless mysteries that surround us in our own time. The fundamental nature of consciousness, the origins of compassion, the strange fact that anything exists at all rather than nothing, these remain as mysterious today as the dancing plague seemed to the citizens of Strasbourg. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a context within which life unfolds. A reminder that existence itself is far stranger and more wonderful than our everyday awareness suggests. The dancers are gone now, their movements stilled by time, their suffering ended by the mercy of mortality. But their story remains, preserved in these ancient documents like pressed flowers that still hold traces of color and form long after the living plants have returned to dust. In remembering them, we honor not only their individual struggles, but also the larger mystery of which they became, however unwillingly, a part. They remind us that we live within forces larger than ourselves, that our small human dramas unfold against a backdrop of cosmic strangeness that we are only beginning to comprehend. And so, as the candle burns low and shadows gather in the corners of this ancient library, we bid farewell to the dancers of Strasbourg. Their steps have carried them beyond our reach, into whatever realm awaits us all at the end of our own brief dances through this mysterious world. May their memory serve as both warning and comfort, warning us against the hubris of assuming we understand forces beyond our comprehension, and comforting us with the knowledge that even in the face of the inexplicable, human courage and compassion can endure. The dance is ended, but the mystery remains, as deep and unsolved as ever, waiting perhaps for future generations to discover new ways of approaching questions that have puzzled humanity since we first began to wonder about the strange world in which we find ourselves. And so, dear dreamer, as the echoes of history fade and the quiet of the night settles in, may your mind find peace and your dreams take you to places even time cannot touch. Until next time, sleep well and dream deeply.